You ever felt outside the scope of traditional medicine or dismissed, not heard, even shamed by the medical community? If so, you're not alone. Diagnosing a chronic illness can be like peeling back the onion skin, right? You got to find someone willing to remove each layer one by one to understand what's causing the trouble. And there are lots of great doctors out there who can help with the process. But in the black and white world of medicine, many patients and even science sometimes lies in the gray. Recently, respected journalist Ross Douthat publicly shared his own story about contracting a mystery illness and the struggles to find a diagnosis and treatment. He details it all in his new book, The Deep Places. Take me back to 2015, at somewhere that you call the zone of total mystery in your life. And I want to applaud you for even engaging this, because you're such an iconic writer. When someone who's at the paradigm, really, of respect starts talking about things that we generally associate with folks on the fringe, it appropriately gets everyone's attention.
So 2015 was supposed to be the best year of my life. My wife and I lived in Washington, D.C. We had this lifelong dream to move back to New England, to Connecticut, where both our families were from. We had 2 kids. We were trying to get pregnant again. And we basically made the dream real. We sold our house in Capitol Hill for a lot more money than we expected.
Good for you.
And we took, we took that money and plowed it into this beautiful 1790s farmhouse in New England with a barn and a meadow and stone walls, basically the whole postcard. And literally the week that we did the inspection on the house, and I sort of wandered through the fields a little bit. And the day that my wife came out of the bathroom with a positive pregnancy test for our 3rd child, I found this red mark on my neck. And it was like a boil, basically, was what the doctor who I showed it to said. It would go away. It did go away, but then I started getting pain in my neck, and then I started getting pain in my head. And about 2 or 3 weeks into this, I had this kind of strange full-body collapse where none of my systems seemed to be working. I, was gagging and had diarrhea and had tingling all over my body, and started having chest pain. And so I was suddenly a mess at this moment when we were, moving in the prime of life, or so I thought, all these things. And so I started going to see doctors. I probably saw 10 to 12 doctors in about 2 months. And the doctors basically said, this is a mystery, you're a high-powered newspaper columnist, you've got a lot of stress in your life, probably this is some kind of mental, physical interplay that we don't understand. And I mean, I was open to that. I was open to anything, basically, that would be an answer. And I went to see a psychiatrist, and interestingly, what I found was I saw 2 psychiatrists, and both of them said, no, look, Ross, this is almost certainly a physical illness of some kind. The kind of pain you're having, the kind of physical symptoms, we don't see a lot of that. But the doctors who were supposed to treat the physical symptoms had absolutely no idea what to do. Well,
let me just focus on that for a moment, because as a heart surgeon, I'll say when I don't know what's going on, one of my defaults is it's in the patient's head.
Right.
So if you're seeing 12 doctors and 10 of them are not psychiatrists and they're telling you, well, there's nothing wrong with you that we can see, did that start to mess with your head, to your psyche? Did you begin to think that you were the problem, not the illness?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. But getting to Connecticut did offer a breakthrough, because once we started seeing doctors in the Northeast, they said, well, look, we see things like this all the time, where the blood tests are negative, you have all these symptoms, you were walking around in the Connecticut woods, the odds are very good that you have Lyme disease, which is, of course, a tick-borne illness that you get by being bit by a really tiny tick. So that was the first sort of really plausible diagnosis I was given. But then if you're given that diagnosis, that's when you pass from mystery into controversy, because there's a huge divide in the medical system about how you treat people who have Lyme disease and don't immediately get better. So about 80% of people who have Lyme disease, you take 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotics, you're pretty much well. But then other people, and of course I was one of those very fortunate, blessed other people.
You're called on to do this.
I took 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotics, and it stabilized me. There was a big change. I was able to sleep 5 hours a night instead of 1 hour. I wasn't going to the emergency room all the time. I lost this feeling of sort of disintegration that I was having all the time. But the pain didn't go away. I just kept cycling through symptoms. And so then you have to make a choice. Because if you go to, the CDC website and read what they recommend for people in that position, they recommend doing nothing. Yeah. They recommend don't take any more antibiotics. Hopefully you'll just feel better naturally over 6 to 9 months. And for my part, anytime I went off antibiotics, all the worst symptoms came back. So then, there is another group of doctors who are often serious, well-trained doctors, but more medical outsiders. They who say, look, if someone has a disease, you treat it for 4 to 6 weeks, they don't get better, they probably still have that disease, and you should probably keep treating them. And you basically, even within the care of these doctors, you have to experiment.
What I always worry about is if we within medicine don't respect people's symptoms and acknowledge just a little bit of humbleness here, people are going to be forced to seek out diagnosis wherever they are. They'll look for validation, if nothing else. And they end up turning to sketchy websites, to message boards, the person next door who may have had similar symptoms. What happened to you when you went to Dr. Google?
The internet, it scared me when I was starting out, because you would go and, you would find someone's blog, someone who, like me, gets diagnosed, right? And they say, this is great. I've been sick for 2 years. I never knew what I had. Now I'm going to start treating, and I'm going to get better. And then you scroll ahead in their blog and you see 6 months of treatment, a year of treatment, people not getting better. And those are the moments when the internet makes you lose heart in certain ways. But then you also find, sometimes on those message boards, you find communities and stories and people who have gone through the process you're trying to go through and have found things that help them. And you find doctors. I was fortunate in this position in having, experience in high levels of journalism. I sort of felt like I knew the internet in a profound and terrible way. Yeah. People who don't have those resources can just get lost. And they can get lost in different ways. They can get lost by following quacks and Pied Pipers, but they can just get lost by being abandoned by the medical system entirely, which happens, I think, to a lot of people.
I remember 13 years ago when we started the show, that unorthodox approach to lying was vilified. I mean, there were all kinds of documentaries about how bad they were. They were actively persecuted, I think. I didn't know much about it, actually. I was naive about what chronic Lyme was. And only later that I began to appreciate that there's some substance there. And brave people who at the time were the pioneers now are being more embraced. But it took a decade, probably, of hard work. All right, when we come back, we'll hear from viewers who feel outside the scope of medicine. Is it all in their head? We're getting into it. This next. We are back with Ross Douthat, author of the new book. It's eye-opening, The Deep Places, about his uphill battle to find treatment for his chronic Lyme disease. It's especially poignant now with COVID, as sadly mistrust of modern medicine has grown amongst many. Let's take a look at some case studies from viewers who felt modern medicine did not believe they had a chronic condition.
The first time I experienced a severe autoimmune flare, I was 14 years old and missed the majority of my freshman year of high school because I was bedridden from pain and exhaustion. It was an incredibly stressful time, not only for me, but for my entire family who had to watch me go from specialist to specialist without getting answers. My life felt completely out of control and I became depressed due to my isolation. Finally getting a diagnosis 7 years after my symptoms initially presented was like taking a breath of fresh air. It was a relief to know that the brain fog, exhaustion, and joint pain weren't just in my head.
There's no cut and dry test for fibromyalgia, just a list of diagnostic criteria, which is why it takes so long. When you hear that story, do you think that we physicians are looking for black and white answers all the time and tests accordingly, whereas you can't really always tell the difference between what's fake and real that readily?
Yeah, I think that doctors are trained to trust test results more than they trust patients. I think doctors are trained to consider patients to be unreliable narrators. And there are good reasons for that. Sometimes patients are unreliable narrators. And obviously blood tests are sort of core central aspects of many of the victories that modern medicine has won over all kinds of diseases.
It's the oldest teaching we have. If you listen to the patient, they will tell you their diagnosis. This is our top scientists at the NIH are exploring why people suffer long after initial tick-borne Lyme disease. We've talked about this on the show a lot. They're looking at whether some of our cells harbor these infections long after regular bacteria have been eradicated with antibiotics. I get the difficulty, but it still requires you to keep peeling away those onions elements, the layers that we talked of, because you won't get a solution otherwise. That's true for a lot of illnesses. We'll be watching all these issues closely and update them as they become available. Coming up, why Ross says there's a connection between his story and the pandemic, plus 3 things you should do if you are looking for answers about a debilitating and chronic condition. Trust in traditional medicine has been declining for decades, leaving millions of people suffering from chronic pain and fatigue. They feel lost in the woods, often turning to quack medicine and conspiracies. And as a surgeon who works both inside the medical establishment and as someone criticized for incorporating innovations and complementary techniques, it disheartens me greatly. That's why when I read respected New York Times journalist Ross Douthat's new book, The Deep Places, I wanted to get him on and share his story. Ross says his experience with chronic illness prepared him for the coronavirus outbreak in March of 2020. There are more parallels between your story of chronic Lyme and chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and COVID than most would acknowledge. What is the most direct link, in your opinion, between what's going on with COVID right now, where we're quibbling about just about everything, and these undiagnosed, unconventional medical treatments that are appealing to many Americans who feel left out?
Well, first, I'm going to give you 2, even though you asked for 1. The first connection is just that there's sort of this baseline loss of trust in the medical establishment that was worsened in the case of COVID because there was, 3 to 6 months where we knew almost nothing. Mm-hmm. And there was this desire to have this sort of authoritative voice saying, it's just the flu. No, wait, it's much worse than the flu. Right. Don't wear masks. No, you have to wear masks. It's not airborne.
Where to?
No, it is airborne, right? And I think that there were a lot of mistakes made by well-intentioned people in the medical establishment early on that contributed to a lack of trust and uncertainty that continues to the present day, joined to the fact that we didn't know, there was no treatment for COVID. So naturally people wanted to experiment, because if you have a life-threatening illness that you're worried might kill you in a month, you're going to be more open to trying experimental and strange things to deal with it if there isn't any treatment available, as there wasn't early on.
Did you get angry at any time through this process, either with your chronic disease from Lyme or with COVID, that you didn't feel heard, or you were frustrated that the system just wasn't working better? Because it should work better, you'd think.
Yes, I was insanely angry, not with COVID. I still have some of that anger, certainly a feeling of disappointment and frustration, but you also have to see the world from the medical establishment's perspective, right? Which is that, the kind of people who end up working on these strange fringes of science conditions are themselves eccentrics, right? They're often strange people, and you get there. I did strange things myself. I didn't just take antibiotics. I had chiropractors put magnets on my body. I ran sound waves through radio frequencies through my flesh. And once you do those things, and you do them because you are desperate and willing to try anything because the sickness is so bad, but you do understand why, someone in a position of authority would look at that world and say, oh man, there's a lot of quackery out there. So I try and maintain, I am simultaneously absolutely certain that the outsider view of Lyme disease is correct, but I also think I understand why the insider view persists and how it sort of self-reinforces, how the two sides reinforce themselves.
So Ross has argued that those of us inside medicine need to take a more of an in-between attitude, where we recognize our own failures and that there's a broader range of experiences. If we do that, we would have less polarization, but it is like religion. You're asking people to give up some of their cherished icons, and it becomes a big challenge when that happens. If we woke up tomorrow, all of us, and that hypothetical became a reality, what would it look like?
I think in the best case, what it would look like is a lot more doctors who are trained and prepared to treat their practice as a little bit more of an art. To say, look, we have a scientific bedrock here. We're not rejecting scientific bedrock. We believe in chemotherapy, antibiotics, vaccines, all of the great victories. But in dealing with the individual patient, both in diagnosis and in treatment, you have to be open to a wide range of possibilities that may not show up on the initial test. It may not be within your normal realm of experience because you have sort of boxes that you're used to checking, and this might be something a little stranger. And then in terms of helping people get better, there really are just clearly diseases that don't yield to 5 weeks of treatment, and you're either dead or you're better.
Yeah, we can't always heal with steel. Hop up, we got 3 pieces of advice for patients frustrated with what's going on in their lives, the lack of diagnosis and treatment. And these are 3 things you can do that can make a big difference. Russ did them, and Russ got...
I did.
And it worked. Okay, so first up, you're going to get many opinions. I've hammered at this. Why was it so important for you?
Well, look, because, I mean, in my case, it took seeing 15 doctors easily before I got to the doctors who said, you know, we see what you have and we understand it. And you can't treat a serious condition without medical help. You can't just do it on your own. But if you're not finding the right doctor, if you have doctors who just either don't take you seriously or for whatever reason because of their specialty can't help you, you have to keep moving, as hard as that is, and obviously sometimes as financially challenging as it can be.
You don't change your diagnosis or your treatment 1/3 of the time. You got to connect with the community. Again, why is that so critical?
What you need is a group of people who are on the same journey as you, who are all open-minded and trying different things, in effect so that you can compare notes and say, oh, well, this isn't working and we need to try something different. So you don't want to get locked. This is the mistake people make on the internet, I think. Instead of looking for a community, they look for one website or one doctor who has all the answers.
And finally, believe that you can get better. And when you were a 1 out of 10, at your angriest, darkest moment,
Yep.
did you believe you'd get better?
Not every day, but enough to keep going. And that I think it's just tremendously important to know that, not every condition is curable. Not every story has a happy ending, but lots and lots of people with an incredible range of complex chronic conditions find paths to getting better.
My final thought's pretty simple, everybody. I'm against any orthodoxy that alienates the sick and drives them further towards nonsense treatments and scams. Frankly, in a perfect world, the medical establishment would embrace humility. That's probably the right word, because real science is slow. It's plodding. We saw it a lot during COVID. It's ever-changing. It's both reliable and innovative if we investigate it that way. But those who are sick in the here and now, like Ross was, they deserve to be heard and not cast aside because they're not fitting the mold. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on new videos to live the good life.